I I really wanted to do something to bring the media, members of the media to TAASA to have a conversation and hear about their experiences covering our movement and Jessica Luther and Sarah Marloff. I mean, first two that came to mind. And they said yes, and they were both available. So thank you both for being here, for taking time out, for doing the free labor of attending this workshop and speaking with, oh, we've got 63 people here, and probably a few more trickling in. So from here, I will let Rick take it over and introduce himself a bit and the two of you.
Everyone, hopefully everybody can hear me okay. My name is Rick Giprich, and I am the Special Projects Administrator for TAASA. I am going on my 10-year anniversary working with TAASA. Prior to that, I spent 11 years working at the Rape Crisis Center in San Antonio. So 21 years now doing this work. And the one thing that continues to get better and still at the same time needs a lot of work is how, as rape crisis centers, or how we as coalitions work and partner and build rapport and relationships with our media folks. They are just as important as advocates in the field. They are just as important as folks who do outreach or who do education in the community, because they are also the people who are telling our stories, and not just our stories for folks that do the work, but they are also really good at telling survivor stories. And that is exactly why we're here today. We invited these two amazing, accomplished journalists to engage in a conversation about what it means to tell survivor stories, about the impact that that has on them, and about the stories we'll never forget. So with that, I want to introduce our two speakers. I'm going to read a little bit about who they are, and then we'll give them an opportunity to talk a little bit more about themselves as well. So we'll start with Jessica. Jessica Luther is an independent writer and investigative journalist who lives in Austin. Her work on sports and culture has appeared in ESPN, the magazine, New York Times Magazine, the Texas Observer, the Austin Chronicle, and Sports Illustrated, Texas Monthly, Vice Sports, and Guardian Sports. Her work gained national attention in August of 2015 when writing for Texas Monthly, and that's when she broke story about a Baylor football player who was on trial for sexual assault. Her debut book on the intersection of college football and sexual assault, Unsportsmanlike Conduct, College Football and the Politics of Rape, was published last year. Sarah Marloff is a digital savvy reporter and editor who loves data, deep dives, and challenging the status quo through thorough, fact-based reporting. She's also a storyteller who enjoys writing about culture through a lens of queerness, LGBTQ+, and women's rights. And she regularly writes about the anti-sexual violence movement for the Austin Chronicle, and her work has given her a deep understanding of social media, blog development, copywriting, public relations, and special event planning. Also a firm believer that dogs, coffee, and glitter make everything better, and I 100% agree. So with that, let's get down to our first question. Oh, I wanted to say something really quickly, sorry. So if you haven't already figured it out, we have prepared questions. So we're gonna be asking our folks some questions. If something comes to you that you want either of them to expand on, or if there's a question that kind of jogs your thinking a little bit, feel free to put that in the chat or raise your hand, and we can call on you and unmute you and get you to ask that question live. So what we may do is we may do a combination of a couple of things. We might answer your question kind of in real time. So if you put it in the chat, if you raise your hand, we'll give you that opportunity. Or we'll have some time at the end to get to some of those questions in the chat that we didn't get to. But both Kristen and Laura are going to kind of monitor those, and then they'll kind of pause, or a natural pausing point where we can ask those questions. All right, so let's get started. So question number one, can each of you share just a little bit more with us about your professional background, and how or when did you decide to become a journalist? What was that thing that sparked the interest? We can start with Sarah.
Sure. Well, I'm super excited to be here, and Yeah. Currently, I'm in DC as the City Lights editor at Washington City Paper, which is DC's alt weekly. I got into journalism shortly after I graduated college when I realized that writing fiction wasn't lucrative. So I jumped into the very, money-making career of journalism. And have been pretty self-taught ever since. I've worked on a lot of blogs, magazines, small neighborhood newspapers. And then when I moved to Austin, I started interning at the Austin Chronicle. That was 8 years ago at this point. And basically, I just never left until they made me associate news editor and the editor of the queer section. So in somewhere at the Chronicle is when I began covering sexual assault. I had a really prolific editor who assigned me a story on the NFL donating to the national hotline after a player punched one of his girlfriends in the face. And it stuck, it resonated with me. I met like 4 people and it snowballed into a beat that I really wanted to cover, and I didn't know, but I've basically haven't gotten off the soapbox since. How about you, Jessica?
Yeah, mine's similar in that I always say there's an inertia to the work, but I am not a trained journalist. I was in grad school for a long time at the University of Texas. I almost wrote a PhD in history that had like nothing to do with this other than it was about power and gender and race. But I was not going to be a professor and I was struggling to finish. And I had a friend say to me that you should write for money, which was not a thing that anyone ever told an academic back in 2012, 2013. And she kind of held my hand and I got into it, but I was still in grad school. So I was kind of writing like op-ed editorial stuff. I figured out I could write about sports and someone would pay me for it. And I thought that was exciting because I love sports. And then I guess for me, the big moment was November of 2013. I went to Florida State. I'm an alum there. And I went there to watch football games. And it was in November of 2013 that I still say like I'm a part of the team, that our quarterback, it was, the story broke that he had been under investigation for sexual assault for the last 11 months, he had been under investigation for 11 months. And that was the first time where I publicly grappled with this issue. I'd done maybe a little bit of writing before that. And I just found that when you write about this topic carefully and in a way that shows that someone has reported that they've been harmed, especially within the sports, that people will reach out to you and want to tell you their stories. And it's like, I can't connect the dots. I don't remember what happened between November of 2013 or those couple of months. And then I wrote my first investigative piece at the end of 2014 about a wrestler at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. And yeah, from there, people contact me all the time still, 8 years later, to do this kind of work. And I just can't say no at this point. Like, I feel compelled to tell these stories. I feel compelled to talk about the way that these institutions work or don't work and the impact that has on people who report into them.
So you both kind of answered this already, but something came up for me as you both were talking about it, that, you did not initially in your career set out to report specifically on sexual assault issues, right? Like, that's not, like a sexual assault nurse. They become a nurse and then they find this interest in working with sexual assault survivors. So you kind of train and go that route, right? So if I can ask, what was it about that first story that you wrote about sexual assault that made you realize that you needed to or wanted to continue telling these stories?
Well, I'll say that one thing for me, the story broke about Winston. Jameis Winston was a quarterback in 2013, November 2013. And I want to say in April, I'm pretty sure that's right, of 2014, Walt Bogdanich at the New York Times, he wrote this great investigative piece that actually looked at the Tallahassee Police Department's response, using Winston as like the lens into like how this police department responded. I remember almost viscerally reading that and thinking, yeah, like these are the questions we should be asking. Like, this is why you don't drop the story. This is why you don't just move on. Like there's so much more here to say. And so for me, when I wrote the first big piece at the end of 2014, I will say one thing was that the school immediately scrapped their Title IX policy and like went to rewrite it. And I was like, oh, okay, like that, you know, that's good, because we had found all these failures in it in this one case. But for me, it often comes down to my relationship with the survivor and like the impact that you can see through that person. Like sometimes it's very clear, like I've written on Baylor, there was a clear thing that happened in response to that. I wrote on the Dallas Mavericks a few years ago. They fired a bunch of people, hired new people, wrote about LSU recently, and there was a big fallout from that. Sometimes it's really obvious, like where the change is coming from. But most of the time, the stuff that sticks with me is like what it means for someone to tell their story in a way that, I don't know if empowers is the right word, but that gives them maybe some closure or makes them feel seen. That's the kind of stuff that sticks with me. And I remember that very well from that first piece, working one-on-one with someone to sort of put all those pieces together. And also, I'll just say, like, to this day, I'm always kind of surprised when I'm still surprised, but I continue to be surprised at the way, at how people respond to reports of sexual violence within institutions. And as long as I'm still surprised, I just feel compelled to like keep digging in those spaces, because it often doesn't seem like it should be as complicated as it is.
Yeah, and you know what makes it really complicated is if you, when you read a piece and then you make the horrible mistake, but it's like a really bad film that you can't turn away from, and you read the comments. That's what always continues to, that's where I get surprised, where I'm surprised that I'm surprised, right? It's the comments, I think, that really get me. So yeah.
I don't read comments. I don't read comments in September of 2014 because I wrote a piece and I got a text message from my editor that said, "Don't read the comments." So I immediately read them, and they were horrific about me. And so that's a bad place.
What about you, Sarah? You were shaking your head when I talked about comments. So
don't read the comments. Just
never
read the comments.
Well, what was it about your first story that made you realize that you needed to continue to tell these stories?
It was actually, I'll definitely say, similar to Jessica. I go with, she said shock, mine is anger. I'm still so mad that football player could punch his girlfriend in the face and people were just like, well, whatever, like, go about your day. And, you know, that's technically domestic violence, but if you start covering one, you'll notice that they're so intricately, you know, so closely connected that it's hard to even separate sometimes. But, you know, I would always been that, like, I remember I used to watch Game of Thrones, I think just to like hate watch, like, are they going to rape someone today? And usually they did. And I can tell you like when they stopped doing that because I was so paying attention. But I just didn't realize, like, I didn't think there would ever be a beat for that or a place to put those like thoughts and concerns. But likewise, like, I'm not here to tell the story of like someone's gruesome rape. I'm here to be like, why don't we take this seriously? Why are there flaws in these systems? Why are survivors treated like this? And why do we have to even have a tag that says like, start by believing or believe survivors? Like, why are we there? Like, if I tell you I was robbed, no one says, were you wearing a short skirt? Like, and it just continues to keep me fired up. And I go with Jessica, I don't want to stop writing about it until I'm not angry.
So that's a really good segue into something else that we were curious about. Do you feel that your work or the work of other people who cover the anti-sexual violence movement, do you feel like it moves the needle for survivors? And there's kind of a follow-up question to that as well, and I'll just go ahead and ask it. But so along the same lines, do you also feel that your work, or even, again, more broadly, the work of other journalists, but specifically yours, do you feel that it, in shape or form, affects public policy, or do you think your stories are affecting policy in any way or form, either for the good or for the bad? So three things. Do you think it moves the needle for survivors? And do you think that the stories that you write or the stories that you tell, or the work and the research and everything that you put into this is really making or affecting change on either the public policy level for good or bad? Sarah?
Yeah, I love this question. Yes, I think that my reporting and Jessica's reporting and the people who are, I think that reporters who are caring about this, their work is changing and moving the needle to help survivors, I believe. Though I have been told by somebody before, and someone higher up and in some power, that covering these types of stories would stop survivors from coming forward. And that was pretty infuriating to me, because I guess, like, especially within the criminal justice system, I have a couple of beliefs of, like, one, survivors should know what they're getting into before they report. Two, reporting on errors and systemic issues within the criminal justice system isn't the problem. The systemic issues and the errors are the problem. And then I do think that, like, it can bring about change. And I think that, like, in Austin, we've seen it in small ways. We saw it when Jose Garza won over for district attorney of Travis County in July's runoff. We saw it, I know I've been told by an elected official that my reporting on the rape kit backlog in Austin helped speed up the council to fund testing more properly. So, you know, I do think there are I do think that things are tangible. I do think that, you know, putting these stories out here causes some people to be scared. I wouldn't be shocked if someone read one of my stories and said, well, I'm not gonna go to APD. And that makes me sad, but not because I wrote it, but because they don't trust the system either. So.
Yeah, that's such a good answer. And this is such a hard question, I think, because, like, I was just in therapy last week talking to my therapist literally about this question of, like, does the work matter? Like, is it worth the cost of doing it, both for me and for the survivors who have to tell me their stories over and over and put them out into the public? And I think sometimes it feels hard. Sometimes I feel hopeless about it. I'm sure everyone in this field has felt that feeling. Like, I feel emotional right now just even thinking about it. But I do think it moves the needle. I mean, it's pretty wild for me to think that Baylor was pre-Me Too. I mean, people know me for that, and I have to remind them that, like, that was actually before. Like, the Me Too was after that moment. And I think we've seen there's still bad reporting and harmful reporting that happens all the time. But I think in general, from the point when I started writing about this, and a lot of my initial stuff was like media critique in 2013, people write about it differently. Even if they understand, even I don't care whether or not they believe it, they seem to get that, like, if they don't do it more carefully, that they're going to be criticized and they're going to have to take that. So they're trying to do it better for whatever reason. And there are more people like me now doing this, and that makes me feel like it's moving something. I've had people tell me that it matters to them, right? Like, survivors have told me that this kind of reporting, this careful reporting, I think one thing, and I'm sure Sarah and probably most of you in this room, one thing that gets me a lot when I talk to survivors, I'm working on a story right now where there was someone who, multiple women have reported now that he abused them when they were minors. And for years, they thought they were the only one. And then come to find out, there's all these others, and it's not them, right? And this is so normal that survivors think that they're the only one who've experienced this. I profiled a ballerina once who had been assaulted repeatedly by her, not coach, what's the word in ballerina world, ballet world?
Sure.
Yeah. And she froze, right? Like, and so for a long time felt like responsible for not fighting back and all that sort of stuff. And then, when she started telling her story publicly, found out that that's a really normal reaction and like what that meant to her. So I know that just telling people stories, they can see what that looks like, right? That was the power of Me Too in a lot of ways. Absolutely, this work has done policy stuff in the state. Like I know that Kirk Watson, when he was a state senator, put forward bills after the Baylor reporting. He was a Baylor alum and he was really upset about it. Pretty sure like SB 212, which is this mandatory reporting law, has a lot of its roots in the Baylor reporting. And I am not personally a fan of that reporting, but of that policy, but like no one's asking me policy. You're like, I'm not giving my opinion about policy. And I certainly have, I mainly write on Title IX policies at universities. And so it's very common in this work to see like those institutions scrap what they're doing and rewrite. Like even my reporting partner that I write a lot with, Dan Solomon, we wrote a piece about UT English a couple summers ago now. And, bless the students, because like the story was a big deal about grad students and power imbalances with professors, but the students took it up and they the student paper did this whole, and UT ended up rewriting their Title IX policy in response to that. So I have seen that. Whether or not those the new Title IX policies are better or effective or are practiced more effectively, maybe, that's to be seen. But you can definitely see, it's interesting to me, especially institutions, the media can really force their hand. Like there aren't a lot of watchdogs on a lot of these institutions. And like even after we reported the LSU stuff, and LSU didn't really punish anybody, but people adjacent and other universities got in trouble. And I was watching a Board of Regents meeting at one point, and they were all saying the right things, all the Board of Regents. And then they got to this one guy and he was like, how do we stop people from talking to the media? And I was like, oh, I don't think you're supposed to say that out loud. But like that was it's not that someone said something, it's that they said it with a bullhorn. So I do feel like, we just need better work, but the media is so crucial in making sure as watchdogs. Like Sarah's work here in the city, like I'm so nervous about the death of local journalism and what that means around these issues on the local level, because it does matter. Like Sarah's work mattered to like what's happening in the city I live in around sexual violence.
Thanks. I also think that it's important to point out when we say politicians too, it's not just the politicians, we're really getting the voters to care, right? Like suddenly you have voters being like, wait, that shouldn't be what happens to a survivor when they go to get help. Maybe I'm upset about this. Maybe I don't want to vote for you. And I think that's really when you start to notice more than not politicians really being like, oh, we're going to do something good. Try to help them. Yeah.
And we saw it like in Louisiana. They had all these kind of hearings around this, and I'm not sure, again, my description is always like, this is a giant cruise ship with a tiny rudder. And so I felt like the rudder turned a little bit in Louisiana. But it was this kind of the politicians were angry, but you could tell that like their constituents were as well, like that this was coming. People were shocked, which was, yeah, you're totally right about that.
Yeah, I have to say, Jessica, that, you said something that really resonated with me. And just to kind of give you an example of how, your story affected so many things. When the story broke, it was in 2015, right? That
it was August 20th, 2015.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So literally a couple of months later, our executive director at the time, she had approached me and said, hey, this thing is going to blow up. And so what do you know about Title IX? And she said, I know that you did a lot of campus work when you worked at the Rape Crisis Center. Is something you'd be interested in kind of exploring? And I was like, yeah, sure. And so because of your story, we implemented this very intentional work to do it statewide, specifically with colleges and universities on their response on Title IX, how they work with survivors, access to services, all of those things. And we continue to do that today. And it's because of the story that, because we knew that it was an issue. And so, so thank you for that. We really appreciate it. And Sarah, I know Kristen put in the chat that your reporting was vital and instrumental in changing the landscape of the Austin community. And it was strictly because of you. So I appreciate both of you and your contribution that you've made to not only to communities, but to programs. You, in essence, you gave us permission and you kind of opened the door for us to say, okay, we've been wanting to do it. And now here's an opportunity for you to partner and bring us to the table. So thank you, both of you.
Thanks for the work that you all do.
Yeah, I'm so glad that it did something.
Yeah. So, okay. So kind of along the same lines, this is we know that you're doing really great work, and we know that you are, to use Kristen's term, shaping and reshaping the landscape of communities and systems and how they function every day. But can you both talk about some of the roadblocks that you come across when doing this work? How, you know, on a parallel, survivors are silenced almost every day from telling by family members, by friends, by institutions, and just people in general who either don't want to hear it or don't believe the word that they're saying, right? And that is a huge obstacle for them. What were the obstacles and the roadblocks that you guys faced for telling these kinds of stories? And is this, when you face these obstacles, are they common, or do they kind of shift and change and like, oh, that's a new one? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Jessica, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I feel like, yeah, of course there are roadblocks. I mean, all that stuff you said about like people that don't believe survivors. I mean, there are certainly editors that I have had and worked with that you feel like it is a lot of work to get them on your side and to let you publish. I mean, there's a whole apparatus. There are lawyers, there are, you know, sometimes there's 5, 6, 7 editors on a piece, and you're trying to get that up the chain and get it out in a way. Like, I am super picky. I'm very famous for being very picky about my language and how exactly I want to say the things that I want to say about this. I think that is critical. And so I have to be real careful in the process to make sure that like they're not changing my language into something that I wouldn't want published. So you can have institutional, you know, roadblocks. I think, you know, we've heard a lot about that. I think Me Too has shown us some of that. I think, you know, journalism has limits. Like, there are definitely limits. I remember after the UVA Rolling Stone article that got retracted back in 2014, Maya Dusenberry wrote a piece for the blog Feministing. She had been a fact checker, and she wrote this great piece about maybe journalism can't do what we want it to do. Like, you know, we need to like recognize that there are limits. And so sometimes I feel there are parts of stories that I do want to tell, and I cannot corroborate them in the way that they need to be under the, you know, the rubric of journalism. I can't get them into the narrative in a way that works, that fits, that that is, you know, smooth, that makes sense to the reader. Like, there are times like that where it's just, there's no workaround and it sucks. Like, it feels bad. You're like, I feel like I'm missing something, but I don't have the pieces. Like, and the pieces just don't exist because of the way that sexual violence works. And that's really hard as a journalist, because you are, sometimes I try not to editorialize, right? When I'm doing investigative pieces within the actual writing itself. Roadblocks, I mean, geez, institutional, like, talk about universities don't want to give you anything most of the time. So I mean, when I worked with LSU, when I did the LSU reporting, I felt very lucky that I was doing it with USA Today, because I'm a freelancer, so I don't have, you know, a place behind me, certainly not with a ton of resources. And USA Today was just a different kind of beast. And so we would hit a roadblock where it was clear that like the document existed or the school should have it, and they were just saying they didn't, or they didn't have to give it to us, and they just sued. And I was like, oh, this is like a thing that you can do. And then every single time USA Today won. LSU didn't win any of those, and it was a huge deal, like what they were forced to reveal. It was clear why they probably didn't want to give that over. And so, you know, one thing that's interesting with Title IX, when I first started reporting this back in 2014, women would go through the process. I've only ever worked with women in the Title IX process, so I'm generalizing. They would get their Title IX report, and then they would give it to you, right? And like that would be part of your source material. And as time has gone on, institutions have gotten smarter. So when I worked on Texas A&M, it was the first time that Dan and I did that piece again for Texas Monthly. That was the first time that and this is now a common practice, the universities won't give the women their actual file. They have to go in person to the department and they can look at it, but they can't take pictures of it, and they can only take handwritten notes. And so we went with a survivor. We're like, well, go. And she had to sign the piece of paper that gave us her, that waived FERPA. And then we got the file. So our names were on the piece of paper for FERPA. And I started taking handwritten notes of the file. If this, we could say we had seen the file, we had read the file. I was taking notes, and they sent a lawyer into the office to stop us from general counsel. And so again, I was fortunate that we were with Texas Monthly. I was like, Dan, you get the lawyer on the phone. Like they wanted to take my notebook. They were saying they're going to take, and I was like, you're not taking my notebook. And so that has been a new thing. It's like, it's hard now for people who report into Title IX departments to even get the paperwork to give to you, so now it's like, how do we get around that? And that was another thing that USA Today sued alongside a survivor for her to get stuff from LSU. So there's like, I feel like that's a constant, you're always digging, and you're always just coming up against a new wall. It's like, oh no, this wasn't how it was a year ago. And then you're like, oh shit, that's because of my reporting. Now they're like implementing these policies that are changing how it is. And I haven't, when I did Baylor, like you couldn't get it is a private university, right? Paula Levine at ESPN very famously was trying to get documents from the Baylor PD, and they would just give her back blank pages in response to her inquiries. And so that kind of thing is just so normal.
So it sounds like kind of for you, the common theme or roadblock is really about the sharing of information from an institution, not so much from a survivor or, telling that piece of the story, but it's really about just access to information. That seems to be the theme kind of that you faced quite a bit, right?
Yeah, I would say, because I mean, there's all kinds of difficulties with interviewing survivors, or if you're finding a survivor. I tend not to do that kind of work, but I have done that with some stuff before. Those are their own difficulties, but I don't ever feel like they're roadblocks, because if someone doesn't want to tell me their story, like that's their choice. They don't owe it to the public to do that, but like an institution absolutely owes it to the public to tell us how they operate and the impact on them. So yeah, when I think roadblock, that's definitely what I'm thinking versus, like finding somebody. That doesn't tend to be, that's just that's true no matter what story you're working on, I guess.
What about you, Sarah?
Yeah, I think so much of it is institutions. And just, I think even what Jessica touched on at first about like corroborating and like what you need to be able to like, as a journalist, how you need to be able to like confirm or get as far as you can to be like, I have backup to say X, Y, and Z happened. I've had people, I am certain that I know of like a predator in Austin, and I couldn't ever get anyone to go on the record because they retract it. And because they were in the scene, and like things like that make it really hard. Like you can't go forward and put someone's life on blast without other people without some kind of proof or something. But having to pull that stuff from stories is really hard. And it happens more than I'd like it to. There are times when like you get leads that you just can't back up enough. And I like in DC, I've been looking into, I'm pretty certain there's some stuff going on with some departments here and how things are run. I know everyone's really shocked. But like, I think that I have the story, other than the editor who I wanted to write it for was like, and you know, I didn't escape me that he was also an older white cis man, but was like, well, without a survivor, like, how is that a story? And I was like, well, I don't know a survivor in DC yet. And I'm like, what do you put out a call on Twitter? Like, hey, were you raped and someone failed you? Like, DM me. Like, that's
I've had editors who are like, can we get a different survivor who this thing has happened to? And I'm like, no, I cannot. Like, why do you need that?
Right.
I have these other ones.
Yeah, I will totally speak up as the communications manager at TAASA that I get so many calls from members of the media, not you two, so y'all know what you're doing, that are, I mean, not just I'm looking for a survivor. And you know, we are a coalition. We focus on policy, training, etc. We are not boots on the ground, so I'll refer them to Rape Crisis Center. That may or may not be able to help, but sometimes their request is so much more specific too. You know, they're calling saying, I'd like to speak to a survivor who is under the age of 18, who was assaulted by a teacher or a mentor or some, like they're writing the story and they need a survivor to fit. And I'm like, try, you know.
And, or they want like, in my former life, I was a communications director as well. And they want a Latinx identified trans person who lives in this part of town who knows this. Can you find that for me? And I'm like, maybe, I don't know, but you know, talking to a survivor and giving them an opportunity to tell their story is impactful. So.
And I think like what, you know, Jessica said so well too, but you can't force someone. And also, I mean, someone maybe can force someone. I'm not trying to force anyone to tell me their story if they don't want to. And I realize that trauma can come with resharing your story. And so like, I think sometimes what journalists don't understand is that like, there are lots of reasons why a survivor might not want to come forward and share that story. And like, even we just said, don't read the comments. Like I've seen sources of mine get ripped apart in the comments. I've seen, you know, I had some dude on Twitter once, and he's maybe one of the only people I've ever actually blocked on Twitter, but responded to one of my stories like, well, if that really happened to her, that's awful, but how do you know it's true? And I was just like, well, I never want to talk to you again.
If that happened, that's bad.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, I hate that formulation.
Oh.
So I'm gonna kind of go off script a little bit because a question came up for me as you guys were both talking about this specific question, but I'm going to ask this from a very from a media journalistic simpleton brain, right? Who maybe doesn't understand the full process, but if all of those pieces that you talked about don't work, right? If you can't corroborate, if you can't, your editor says, no, we need to talk to another survivor. Why can't y'all just tell a story? You know what I mean? So, and I say that from an advocate perspective, because a lot of times our job is spent in the community telling survivor stories. And to us, it's not that it doesn't matter whether it's true or not. What matters is the impact that that's going to have on the community to basically, you know, give a shit and to care and to say, oh my God, this happened. But from your perspective, can you talk a little bit about what your obligation or your responsibility is when telling either a survivor story, a story in general? Why can't you just tell it? Do you know? Do you know where I'm going with that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it
seems like there's so many these factors and all these things that kind of get in the way of just telling a story.
Yeah, I think there are different things that happen, right? So it depends on if you're naming somebody, right? That's when you start to get in really tricky legal territory. And so a lot of what you're doing is making sure that if you go to court, what are you going to be able to tell the judge about how much work you put into corroborating and backing this up, right? And so if you're not naming someone, it's a little different, right? It's not quite that same level of responsibility under the law. And so why can't, I mean, most of the time you do just, I do feel like a lot of the time it is telling someone's story. So I'm working on one right now, and I was just, Dan and I are working on something right now, and we were just talking, and it is a lot of like she says, right? Just over and over again, and we can't there's no corroboration here, right? Like we are going to, she gets credit for telling us that this happened. She's an expert on her life, right? But as soon as it becomes like, we still have, someone's going to get named here. And so like, we do have to ask that person if they want to respond. Like you do have, that's a legal obligation. Yeah. But if you're not, so if I'm going up against an institution, so like when we were working with LSU or on LSU, like a lot of the time it wasn't necessarily about, well, some of it was about the perpetrator, like the person who harmed. We were talking about football players and we called them and that sort of thing. But it was mainly the institution at that point. Again, if you're going to name someone at the institution, you have to legally talk about them or give them a chance to respond and all those sorts of things. So in case you go in front of a judge, you have receipts. And I do think that is an overriding force in a lot of this work. And I will just say the other part is there's the editorial side. And like Sarah was saying, you have editors who just don't believe, don't think it's that. Can it be that bad? Are you sure? Do you have more proof that it is that bad? And so whether or not you personally feel like that's enough, sometimes you just like, I mean, I could write a blog, I guess, and put it up there. But if you want it to be under the label of this hallowed institution or like whatever it is, I mean, there's more force forever if it's going up and at an outlet versus just, a Facebook post or something like that. That, I mean, and that sounds, I hate even saying it out loud to you. Like, I hate that it functions like that. And that those are things that I have to consider when I'm writing. But yeah, I think it is just that kind of stuff with editors and lawyers. Like when you hand over the draft to the editors and lawyers, you never really know like how they're going to respond to that. And they are people of this world too. They have come up in this rape culture alongside the rest of us. They have not done the education that all of us here have done around these issues. And so like, we think we're surprised, holy moly. Like for them, sometimes I work with editors who never had someone report a sexual assault, do reporting around sexual violence. So you feel like you're coaching them as much as you are getting the piece done. So did that answer your question? I know it's not satisfying. I wish I had a satisfying answer. But I think that's just, I think that is the limit of journalism in our ability to do this kind of work.
Yeah. Thank you, Jessica. What about you, Sarah?
Well, so much of that too, it is the limit of journalism, and it's like the double-edged sword, right? Because you also don't want to run a story that isn't true. Like, God forbid you run a story about someone who, the one person who ever made up I can't even believe I'm saying that, but like, you want to have the things that say like, I did the reporting and this is something you can trust and you can trust me. And like, you can trust the work that we've put into this. And that makes it, again, double-edged sword. Like, you want to say you can trust the media, but to trust the media, you have all these checks and balances and editors. And it just ends up being sometimes a battle. There were some stories that I didn't break because I had an editor at one point who kind of shrugged them off. Still upset about it, but I've had an editor who came into my office once after the third time of me writing like an updated case on or updating like a case that was going on. And she was like, I finally understand why this is so upsetting. And I was like, finally, like, where have you been? I recently, in my year of freelance last year, I wrote for a place where the second editor, I had to, like, he came in at one point and was like, why aren't we using the word victim anywhere? And just like Jessica said, there are words that I'm very intense about using. Like, I choose my words very carefully when I write these pieces, and I shouldn't have to explain to you why I chose them. But you do. And it's just, I think, like, you're constantly, no one is comfortable talking about sexual assault, except maybe the weird group of us on this panel. And so you're making so many people uncomfortable by writing these stories that there's pushback in a lot of places. There's even pushback in, I don't know if that's ever happened to you, Jessica, but like, I've had people who told me their stories and then like 3 days later called and were like, oh my God, please don't print that. Please don't ever run that. And I'm not going to run that, but that's, I can't do anything then with that. Like, your hands are tied. So yeah, I don't know if that also answered your question, but.
It did. And it kind of leads me to another question. If you both could maybe name or tell us about a time when there was a story or topic that you really wanted to write about, but you couldn't or weren't given, I hate to say the word permission, but they didn't give you the go ahead to tell this story, or that you said, this story is important, this voice needs to be heard, and someone told you no. Is there one story that sticks out for either one of you where you couldn't tell it and you really wanted to?
I don't remember getting like a no, we can't. Like, I mean, I'm freelance, so that means like I pitch everything. And so I do a ton of work on spec is what we call it, right? Like, I do a ton of work that I'll never get paid for unless maybe eventually something gets published. So I'm much better now at knowing what I have before I pitch it even to begin with. And so it takes some work to figure out. Like, sometimes you can tell pretty quickly whether or not something will make, whether or not it has the pieces that are necessary. And some of those, it sounds gross to say them out loud, but like, whether or not there's a story, like there's a narrative here, like, is this, and I hate
compelling.
that part. Yeah, is it compelling? Do you have the right characters? Which sounds so gross because you're talking about real people. It isn't fictionalized, but so most of the time, by the time I go to pitch something, I feel pretty confident that all those pieces are there. And that's part of the pitch, is like that I think that stuff exists. And I will say I've been doing this long enough now too that there's certain editors I like a lot more than others. And there are people I trust a lot more on that side of it too, that I'll go to with stuff. But like, yeah, mine is more like, I mean, part of how I got pulled into the USA Today crew, I was with this big project there as an only freelancer with this whole staff, because I actually worked on that story for 1.5 years and couldn't do it on my own, which made me feel better when we started suing. I was like, okay, I wasn't like, it wasn't just me. Like, you have to have institutional money and power in order to do this story. But I just felt like I'm never going to get there. Like, I'm just never going to get where I can pitch this in a way that an outlet will take this on. Even though people trust me now, like I have my own reputation, and that goes a long way. So for me, it's more stuff like that where I can't bring it all together. I mean, so Dan and I wrote the piece in August of 2015 about Baylor, and then we wrote a huge follow-up piece, I want to say 3 years later, at Deadspin. That piece had a life. It was at 4 different major outlets, 3, before it ended up at Deadspin. We got kill fees. Like, if you work on a piece long enough and then they kill it, often you get paid for the work you did, even if the piece didn't publish. And we got at least 2 outlets paid us pretty significant kill fees for all the work we had done on it. And we took it to Deadspin. We really loved love Diana Moskovitz. She does a lot of this kind of work in sports, and she was our editor there. So we trusted her, and we were just tired. We have been working on it for 3 years, I think, at that point. And so there were a lot of no's there, I guess. Like, that was one case where we were told if we could find the right victim. And we already had 12 like we had so many, and we just didn't have I don't even know. And I wasn't willing to do any of that. Dan was not either. We always agree on that. So but probably that one, like, man, that was exhausting. The day after we published, we both were like, wow, we can wake up and we don't have to actively think about Baylor today for the first time in like 3 years. So, yeah, that one was hard. Part of it too, in this, Sarah, I'm sure you've experienced this. We would get people and people are tired of the story. And I'm like, okay, I don't, what do you want me to do with that? Like, I feel this with gymnastics right now. Mm-hmm. We're having a moment with Simone and Biles and everything around that. But I personally happen to know that there are people who feel that gymnastics stories, like, people are just tired of them and they're not going to want to read it. And so, like, why do this?
I feel like sometimes it's because we're ruining it for them.
Oh yeah.
Like,
yes.
I just want to enjoy gymnastics, and I just want to, cheer my team on, and I just want to root for these young women to succeed. And you guys have to go and talk about all this rape stuff and all this other bad stuff. Like, why can't we just enjoy the sport? I get that. And I hear you, Jessica, that you're right. And I think that leads to that fatigue, and it's also tiring. It's also tiring for us because we're tired of hearing you say you don't want to hear about it.
Yeah. But I'll just get that with Title IX. Like, do we need another Title IX story? And it's like, well, apparently, like, it's still happening. I don't.
Yeah. What about you, Sarah?
I think that, like, I've been pretty lucky, at least in my last couple of years with, at the Chronicle. There wasn't a lot of people are tired of this, and I credit to my editor for being like, absolutely, like, this is a story and this matters, and you're going to keep covering it, because that's empowering, right? Like, that gives you this chance to, like, keep digging. But that's, one major story that I could follow for a long time. I've had probably, like, several stories that I never got to run because in some way or another I got a no, but I never got, like, a straight no, I don't think, from, like, an editor being like, no, this story is useless and we have no interest. But it would be like, well, this is, there would just be like 3 little pieces missing, and therefore it just never became a story. It was just, I have like 3 stories that are still in, like, my file cabinet in my living room that I literally moved from Austin to DC because one day I'm going to find all those pieces, right?
Same. Yeah.
I think, like, and probably the people whose stories don't get told maybe don't know this, but, like, I feel nauseous sometimes when I can't put them together. Like, I feel awful. Like, you're sitting there with this, like, jigsaw puzzle and not figuring out how to make it work and not having the resources. And, like, as freelance, you're constantly hustling to be like, well, I have to also feed myself. And as a staff writer, you also have all of the other jobs that go along with, being in an office. And I mean, routinely, I would pull 50-hour weeks, sometimes 60-hour weeks. And some days you just hit a point where you're like, I don't know where to find the time to do all of this research that I need to be able to make this story work. And those are the most frustrating roadblocks, when I can't even tell you exactly who was that roadblock, other than there were just too many things that didn't line up at the right time.
So we've got just a couple more questions, and then I know that the chat is kind of going crazy, and I want to make sure that we get to some of those comments and questions as well. But do you think that, and I'm using this term, but mainstream media, when you think of the trifecta of news media outlets, ABC, CBS, NBC, are they doing enough? Are they dedicating themselves enough to the type of media coverage regarding sexual assault or anti-sexual violence work or the movement itself? I feel like we are hearing these stories enough from the voices in power, right? The big talk. I mean, I can kind of answer that from just a viewer's perspective. Yes, to an extent, but it's very reactive. It's only when something happens that we're hearing it. We don't hear it consistently. And then when we do, we're hearing one opinion, and then we're hearing another opinion, and then we're hearing truth, and we're hearing fiction, and then we're hearing sensationalism, and then we're hearing just this blasé attitude about it. So, it's not consistent. Like, the messaging across the board isn't consistent. So how do you feel the mainstream media is doing, dedicating themselves to telling these stories? And do you think they could be better?
Oh, they can be better.
I mean, we can all be better.
Right.
Let's start there. Like, everyone can be better. But I don't, Jessica, if you want to start, I'll totally.
I think my answer to this.
How can they?
Oh, how can they? Well, I feel like a lot of the time people who report on this are, on some level, I think it should be a beat. And I also think that's a really tall emotional, mental order for someone to actually have it as their beat.
I'm a therapist.
Yeah. I mean, I have a therapist. Like, as I said, I was there last week. But I think I guess, like, it's so nice to actually be in a space where everyone already knows what I'm talking about. But, like, you all know, like, these things are complicated, and there is a real expertise to understanding how this works, especially because we live in a culture that actively doesn't want to understand how these things work, and feeds us narratives that are wrong and are false. And so you have to do a lot of your own kind of reprogramming to understand how all of these things work. And so once, like, part of the reason I keep doing this work is because, like, I don't want someone else to do it. That sounds, and I don't mean that in, like, I'm great and they're not. It's that, like, I just know I know so much about Title IX now, and it's taken me 8 years to get to this point where I feel really confident. And that's not even true. I don't know if really confident, but I feel way more confident than I would expect just a reporter who's pulled off another beat to suddenly go into this, especially I do sports, and you just get a lot of dudes who, like, all of a sudden they go from literally reporting on, like, what happens on the field or in practice to, like, sexual violence within the hierarchy and power, the way that power works within an institution, when you have a federal law and you have state law, and, like, they don't know what they're doing. And why would they, right? Like, why would we expect them to? And they don't have the language. They haven't thought for years about exactly what words they're going to use, and what's harmful, what's not. Like, I do think there's a difference, though, between, I think we do need to, like, there's a difference between reported media and punditry and talking heads. So I think a lot, like, something I think a lot about is with all the Me Too stuff, and the New York Times is, like, pumping out this stuff, and it's, like, incredible. There was, like, a moment there where it was just like, whew. And they did this huge story on, I want to say it was a Ford plant outside of Chicago, maybe. And again, I can't even remember. Like, I'm sitting here and I don't remember the details, but I do remember that it was mainly women of color, mainly Black women, who were victimized within that space. And they did great work. Like, it was good reporting, but that is not the story that then gets picked up in, like, the way that, media cycles. And I can't even say that I understand how that works, actually. Survivors always want to know before we publish how big the piece is going to be. And I'm like, I honestly have no idea. Like, I have a theory about, like, why Baylor hit the way that it did in that moment. But, like, that's my theory. And, like, we didn't have no idea that was going to happen. And so I do think there's a difference between what actually is reported, the reporting that's happening. I think the Washington Post has a lot of good reporting around this topic, not all the time. They have their own shit going on right now. But what gets picked up within our culture and like what gets talked about and what gets acted on, that's different, and it's a problem, even if we still have problems within what media stories are getting out there. Right. I don't know. Sometimes I feel like I can't give a satisfying answer.
No. You're saying a lot and everything at the same time, which is really great because it's giving us a lot of thought and process in how this works. So I appreciate that. What about you, Sarah? Do you think that our media is doing enough, or are they dedicating enough time to telling these stories?
I think it's complicated. I think I think we can always all do more. And I think that this is a very hard beat to have. It is depressing. There are days when I break down into tears and my wife thinks I'm absolutely nutty. And I'm like, sorry, I'm rethinking of a traumatic conversation I had with, holding someone's trauma is hard. Which is not to say that having that trauma isn't hard, but you're doing some of that legwork. And so I can understand why there's not a mad rush to have a, sexual assault beat at every media room. And I also think that there's a lot of people who believe it's not big enough to be a beat. Like there's not enough stories, nothing's happening all the time on that front, which again, this room might be like, that's not true, but convincing that to a staff is a lot harder. When I see stories of stuff, I always think I guess when I think about how to be better, I think when I think about it of and this goes from all the conversations I've had with survivors and so many conversations with advocates, some of who are on this call right now. But and what is the story you're trying to tell? Are you trying to be here's some trauma porn, let me describe this person's rape in graphic detail, which I personally don't think I ever need to read again. Or are you trying to be there's a serial rapist running around town. There's a, issue with sexual assault numbers climbing. There's a backlog of rape kits. There's, issues within the criminal justice system. The story is those things, the story is what are we trying to do to change this outcome? It's not someone's rape. And I think that so often I hate to use the word glamorized, but that's the part that I think media can too easily fascinate on. People want to be well, how gruesome was her rape? How bad was her rape? As if there's a number on it. And also not to just say everyone gets raped, not just women. But so often it is women. And so I just think you have to come at it of a way of what are you trying to do with this story? What is the point? When I tell a story, am I just trying to I'm not trying to just write something to put some words on paper. I'm trying to make you think about, what do you think your criminal justice system should do? What do you think if you got a rape kit? When would you want it tested? If it was your kid's rape kit, when would you want it tested? Do you want your kid going to bars downtown when this is what happens? And what are we doing to make it not happen? And I think that's kind of the best way to look at it. And I'd also say for a lot of journalists, if you wanted to get into this beat, I think it's really, really important to connect with advocates first and foremost. It takes a while to build all of the trust that you need to do this reporting well, in my opinion. And if you want to do it, you should probably put in the legwork. And that might mean coffee at 7 a.m. on a Friday, but you probably won't regret it. And it'll connect you to a lot more things than you probably have any idea about.
Yeah, that's a really great point about media connecting with advocacy or with advocates and with rape crisis centers. I think that's one of the keys to building that relationship, and getting journalists on boards, getting journalists to come and volunteer or to attend a training, right? Not for any ulterior motive, and just we do, because like you said, all of us would beg to differ. And I've oftentimes said in the community, if there was a channel devoted to telling survivor stories, that channel would run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and you would still hear new things all the time. Because when you live in a community like the one that I live in San Antonio, where you respond to the hospital 2 to 3 times a day, and that's just based on what we know about reporting, and then actual sexual assaults happen constant. And so I hear you. Yeah. Those are the kinds of things that I think, as advocates, we sometimes don't understand, like why reporters aren't interested in what we have to say, or why they're not interested in telling the story. Because we need to build those relationships, and we need to invite them into our space and have really good conversations about it. Not with the expectation that, oh, I'm going to go tell my story, but because we want you invested in what we do every day.
And I just emphasize,
I just have a question.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, speaking of great advocates and activists, Amanda Lewis, TAASA staff member, and I know you both know her and have worked with her. She's had her hand raised for a bit here.
I'm sorry, Amanda. I didn't see it. It blended into your background.
Oh, no, it's all good. I just wanted to just share like how impressed and inspired I am by Sarah and Jessica. I remember meeting you, Jessica, like during, I think, budget hearings or something, where you came to support survivors through that process, like 2016. And Sarah, you've been holding it down in Austin. I feel like anyway, so many conversations with Sarah. And I just want to say that the way that y'all do your work, as being on the other side of your stories, is so careful, so thoughtful. So much like from a learning perspective. And so, in our field, we value informed consent, right? So the way that you're always like, here's what I'm going to, here's what the story looks like, or here's the language I have, is it right? Like all those things are so, I think, valuable in our field as well. And I will tell you, I mean, Kristen, we've worked together locally. And there are journalists we don't talk to, right? Like, and I think anybody that does media relations work has those folks that we don't give them stories. We can't, because of these kind of lack of care. And so I think my question is, for advocates, we talk about building those relationships. Does it feel different? Thinking about the trauma of sexual assault, how you build those relationships, how you take care during those stories. And what would you say to advocates that want to build those relationships with media about how to do sexual assault stories well, that requires kind of another level, and then how to know when, some people just don't got it. They ain't gonna get it, don't got it. But do you recommend, are there trainings or resources that you've seen about like, how do we get, because I didn't have media training, and a lot of folks maybe don't have access to that. So, so advocates might not have the tools to then like build those, teach you how to do that. So anyway, if there's anything you can share, I would be greatly appreciated.
I think that I saw Jessica's head nod for tools and like more official things. And so I'll let her talk to that, because I know none of those. But I would say that there's a lot of reaching out. Like if you see a journalist on Twitter and you think they said something intelligent, message them, DM them, find their email, ask them if they want to get coffee. I feel like most journalists are kind of, you look for a story, whether or not, to put it in black and white terms, you're looking for a story. So if someone says, hey, let's get coffee, I'd love to like connect with you, 9 out of 10 times, I think a journalist says yes. And I know like that's really, I started with, one advocate taking some kind of trust on me to have long conversations. And I felt so seen by that I've been very like, never, break this trust. If she says something that's not allowed to be in the light of day, it doesn't go in the light of day. But I think that like having someone who was willing to take a chance and talk to me about it has helped me fall into this work more. So I would say, if you see a writer that you think does good work, and it doesn't have to be sexual assault, you know what a good writer looks like. Never hurts to reach out, or to reach out to an editor and say, I'd like to come in and talk to your news team. But I don't know if editors are great at that.
Yeah, I know. I was wondering that too, because like it was interesting. The Houston Chronicle ran a front page article about Deshaun Watson, and like, I don't know if everyone here has kept up with that story, but it was like from the perspective of his family and friends, and it was just. And I wrote the editor an email explaining why I thought this was a harmful piece of writing to exist on the front page of the paper. And he was just like, no, it's fine. And I was like, okay, well, I feel like I have an expertise here. So, I'm concerned about the community of Houston, the survivor community, but good luck to you. I do think it's interesting because, again, I do university work, and again, I'm talking a lot of the time to sports reporters, and they can't imagine the university beyond the campus. They only think of it there. And often they only think of the athletic department. And so when I'm talking to other journalists, I will say, reach out to the student groups. Like, there are definitely students doing this work on campus already. I will say that was not true in Baylor in 2015, but has since. I think we're in a different world now with that. But also I will tell them, call the Rape Crisis Center in town. There are people in the community already doing this work, and they will have never thought, that's just not, and I don't know when I learned that. Mm-hmm. When did I learn that was the right resource? But I can't actually tell you that. But TAASA, I reach out to TAASA for help when I'm reporting all the time. I don't know if there are good media. There are definitely good media guides for media reporting on sexual violence. And I'm not sure if that would help advocates, but I wrote a piece 2 months ago, maybe, for Global Sports Matters. And I wrote about how I write and report on sexual violence. And I ended it with a bunch of links to media kits that exist on how to do this right. And a lot of them are created by local rape crisis centers or, advocates. It's a lot of advocate work that I utilize all the time. But yeah, I think what Sarah's talking about, there's always the risk, right, that you're going to give your time and your attention and hand over a story and someone's going to mess it up. And we all know in this room that that causes harm. it's not some kind of neutral act that's happening. That is harm that's being done. But this is such a hard, you got at something, right, Amanda, by asking us this question, because it is how do we do this networking better and this communication better, and how do you guys do it from your side and us from our side? And I'm with Sarah in that every piece of writing that I do, it has to be right. I know I have not done everything right. And people tell me that, and they're right to tell me that. And I learn and I try to do better, and I try to not hold on to it for years. But I do think that I am showing that I'm doing careful work. And then when an advocate looks me up and is, whether or not they're willing to get on the phone with me, that's the thing that I'm showing. You can read how I've done this in the past and make a decision on whether or not you want to talk to me. But if someone's brand new to the beat, it's how do you, at some point you're trusting, and if they're not, Sarah and I have been through this, I am always put my armor on to go talk to the editor, because here we go. But if you're not used to that, who knows what's going to come out the other side. So I feel like I'm just here not giving you satisfying answers, but I do think you're hitting on something, the fact that I can't quite get there.
But it's these kinds of things, though, that kind of lends itself to you having a conversation with advocates to help you be better at your work and maybe answer some of these questions. And then also advocates learning from you. I remember doing this work too, and we would do a lot of exercises in in how we want a story to be told. And this was just us as advocates trying to be better. And we would sit down and we would say, okay, this story happened. Here are the facts. Now let's write a piece from a counseling perspective, from a trauma perspective. Let's write a piece about what it means to prevent this from happening. And then let's write a piece about crisis intervention and how that is important. Had the same case or the same story, but you had these three different perspectives, how you wanted to tell that story. And so, we did that quite frequently at our program, and that just helped us be better when we were talking to the media or we were talking to other people. So I'm sure everyone here appreciates what you guys are saying. And I thank Amanda for asking that question, because that was literally the last question ask, is what message did you have for advocates on who are reluctant to talk to you? So let's say this, we've got about 10 minutes. I want to give space to folks that have been putting questions or comments in. Or also, what I realized is that I can't see the hand raise on my end. So if anyone would like to raise their hand and ask a question live, please feel free to do so. Either Kristen or Laura will ensure that you get heard. Or if you have a question, put it in the chat and we'll talk about it.
And I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, although one message. Yep. Not seeing any questions in the chat. So if anyone does want to raise their hand or ask in the chat box. Yeah, we've got 10 minutes. And I just want to thank you both in case we run out of time. This has been wonderful. So, validating and just informative, and just so good to hear your perspectives.
Well, thanks for having us. It's not that often that I'm talking to people who already know a lot about this. I was talking to an advocate not that long ago from Know Your Nine, and we were on the phone and realized that we didn't have to explain everything to each other. And it was this moment of oh yeah, you already know what I'm talking about. It was such a relief. Whenever I end up talking to Rick about something, it's oh, we already know, we already know this. You feel oh, thank goodness. Cause I do feel so much of the work is educating the people you're talking to about the thing you're talking to them about. So
even the writing of it can feel that way too, So.
Yes. What do the readers need to know?
Exactly.
What am I assuming the readers will bring to this that I have to operate against? Yeah.
Without going so far in the weeds that I lose them.
Yes.
Is that frustrating for you as journalists wanting to tell a story that you have to, not that you have to consider your reader, you always have to consider your reader, but that you have to either choose different language, or you can't go into the weeds as much as you want, or you want to get existential, or you want to just speak your truth in this piece, right? And you sometimes can't because you lose this person. Is that frustrating for you, and how do you navigate that?
You have to, I think Sarah said it earlier, so much of it is keeping your eye on the prize. What is it that I'm actually trying to do with this work? And a lot of time for me, it's the institution had a process, they failed, this was the impact, with the implicit thing that something should change here. You're not even out to prescribe that necessarily, right? You're just here's what they said they're going to do, here's what they did, this is why it was harmful, and then put that into the world. And so sometimes you do have to drop things for narrative. You need the reader to stay with you, right? You need them to stick with you. And so there are times where, you just have to let things go. I'm so precious. It's so funny. I saw this funny tweet once about writers where as you're writing it, you're I'm the worst writer who ever lived. And then you give it to your editor and you're every word is precious. You cannot touch it. And you live with that dichotomy, but certainly true with this, where I'm working on something now, again, with Dan, this piece is just in the front of my head. And we don't really fight, but we're having a back and forth on there's something that one of us really wants and the other one isn't sure that the narrative fits and is worried that it's going to muddy what the reader takes from this. And so you know, we haven't taken it to the editors yet, but we're going to ask their opinions once we get there. But that's part of the process, right? Is like it's like, that's why I like working with other people when I do this work, especially ones I trust, like Dan. You know, like I'm in there saying, this is why we have to do it this way. And if we lose it, this is what we lose. And that's how it affects the final product. And he's in there telling me why the other side. So I do think sometimes I have to remind myself what the end goal is. And is this meeting it? And sometimes you just have to let it go.
Yeah.
And I'm going to brag on Jessica because without giving anything away, but I know you're working on this story with Dan because you reached out to me and I put you in touch with our general counsel, Liz, about one sentence. I think you were working on one sentence and you weren't sure how to say it. And I don't know if you know how long your piece is going to be, but several hundred, couple thousand words. And the fact that you reached out because you wanted to get this one sentence right. I mean, I don't think people who read your work and Sarah's and the work of so many journalists just don't really understand just how much goes into a 700 or 800 word piece, much less a book or a series. So, just kudos to both of you because you are so thorough and knowledgeable and compassionate in your work, which I think there's so much, certainly when I was coming out of college, it was all about objectivity. And no, it turns out you can be a compassionate journalist and you both are. So
I will say you guys were super helpful too. And I ended up we ended up quoting a source instead of trying to put it in our own words because our own words were not going to do the thing justice that we needed to do there. And but even that was so shocking. The piece is a lot about child sexual abuse, which is not something I've written on before. And I was so caught off guard. I've been doing this a long time, and I think too much probably about language choices, and I judge other reporters' language choices. I do the whole thing. And I was like, I said to Dan, I was like, we don't have a cultural language that really, like, as a society, we don't have a good way to talk about this. And then that butts up against, again, the lawyers and the editors, and like, it bums me out. It's like, we don't, as a reporter,
I think it's just like trying to be trauma informed. Like, I think that's, there is, like you said, there's not a cultural language, but it's being intentional about understanding, trauma and the consequences, right, and its impact. And so you try to be as trauma informed as possible. And both of your work is really from that lens. And as advocates, we appreciate that.
It's so interesting because we euphemize so much of it, especially when children are involved. And we do it all the time just in general, but there's a lot of euphemizing and or a strictly legal context. And we don't have like any kind of space. I don't even know what I'm looking for because I don't even know how to think outside of like a legal apparatus. Like I can see my limits there in my own imagination. But I've been feeling it on this piece in a new way that I haven't in a long time because I got really comfortable. Like when I write about Title IX, I have a very specific way. And this was like, shit, I don't know the right words. And if I don't know the right words, what is that? Whew.
I strongly feel, and I was just having this conversation with just some girlfriends, when a big story or thing happens, like Me Too, like George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, I feel like there is language that doesn't exist until those stories happen. And I mean, just think about the last couple of years. And I know some of you, I'm just a white, trying to be an ally, trying to be woke, not there yet. But trying my ass off. And I feel like there are just words, that language came a couple years ago. No one was talking about, at least not in my circles, white fragility, white defensiveness, the word performative, that wasn't a thing that we talked about as, allies and white people trying, like the language came, but it came after those stories happened. It came after that, what's the word I'm looking for? These awakenings, that's a terrible word for it. But so I feel like that, I know what you're saying. And with child sexual abuse, Yeah, I mean, even just saying those words makes some of us uncomfortable and having to write about it. But I feel like those stories happen and then the language comes.
Yeah. And I'm sure it was Sarah, like, and as we're writing it, we're like, and an editor is going to question this and a lawyer is going to question this. And so we're writing, trying to make sure that like, that doesn't, it's hard. Like it can be really difficult to navigate all those different ways to get the piece out in the way that you want it to. So
I just think about how many times too, like not only are you going through like those things as well, but also like my notes sometimes, like I'll have things that are literally like, this is off the record, this is on the record, this is off the record, and just making sure like I didn't put anything that's off the record in here. And you're juggling a lot of balls.
Thank you both so much. We are right at time. If I'm not mistaken, this is being recorded, and so we should have access to the chat as well. So if anything comes up, what we'll do is we'll kind of pose those questions to you, and hopefully you guys can answer them via email. I want to say thank you again. Your perspective and your knowledge and your expertise and your skill set in telling these important stories are a gift. They're a gift to us, they're a gift to the community. And in a lot of ways, it validates the things that advocates do every day. It puts faces and words to the horrific things that we see. And so more than you probably will know, we appreciate you for that. And we respect you for it, because it's nice to have allies. It's nice to have people on the other side of what we do who get it and who understand and who are just like us, constantly moving to be better and to tell better stories and to support and validate a survivor's experience. So thank you so much from all of the TAASA community, from the advocates who work in this field. Thank you. Thank you for what you do, and keep telling those stories because we need you.
thank you all so much. This is lovely.
Agreed. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Don't forget to fill out your survey. It should pop up immediately after you close this session. Your feedback is important to us, so please tell us what you'd like us to hear, okay? All right, everyone, enjoy the rest of your day, and we will see you soon. Thank you for being here.
Bye.
Bye.